Captain Steve Rogers has been a mainstay of the Marvel Cinematic Universe since 2011, facing down Nazi regimes, robotic armies, and even his own fellow Avengers, before leading the charge against Thanos in Wakanda and later at the ruins of the Avengers compound. After an extensive career as a soldier, an Avenger, and a fugitive, the living legend, the man out of time, was finally able to live out his well-earned retirement in the closing minutes of Avengers Endgame. This ending for such an iconic character has been a point of contention among fans, with many believing that this ruined his character arc by leaving Bucky in the future alone, and seemingly wrecking Peggy Carter's marriage in 1949, and with the recent release of Loki and the revelation of the existence of the TVA, his retirement has been brought into question yet again. Many fans have pointed out that him living out a life with such a notable figure as Peggy Carter, founder of S.H.I.E.L.D., would have created a Nexus event, and would have likely been pruned by the TVA. But what if there was a different explanation that solved a lot of these problems posed by fans? Maintained Captain America's character as a selfless hero, ensures that Peggy Carter's home life remains unchanged, and gives a logical reason for why Steve and Peggy weren't arrested and pruned by the TVA. There are two explanations for how this may have worked, and they each come from the comments made by both the writers and the directors of Endgame. Directing duo Joe and Anthony Russo have largely disagreed with the screenwriters Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely regarding the time travel logic proposed in Endgame, and the time travel mechanic implemented by the Loki series only makes it that much more convoluted. The directors famously state that Steve lived on a branching reality, while the screenwriters claim that Steve lived out his life on the main MCU timeline, living in the background of the MCU as we know it, and only re-emerging in the final minutes of Endgame to pass on his shield to Sam Wilson. This leads to two different theories, so let's explore both of these options and how one of them may have more to it than we first realized. The first, and simpler of the two explanations, is that if Cap did in fact live on the same timeline as the main MCU, then this would mean that the husband that Peggy Carter talked about in her Smithsonian archive in Captain America: The Winter Soldier never actually existed, and that this elusive husband was actually Steve all along. This means that Steve is not a homewrecker, and the children of Peggy Carter are in fact his. Many fans have pointed out the presence of a mysterious gray-haired man at Peggy Carter's funeral, claiming that this is in fact old Steve Rogers living out his retirement. While this explanation has its own collection of issues, it could explain how Steve was able to live out a life with Peggy without ruining her home life or being arrested by the TVA, as well as why he never interfered with any of the coming events throughout history despite knowing about them. If he knew how the events were meant to transpire, then he could have elected to live in the shadows and let the course of the universe play out exactly the same as they had the first time around, to ensure that he eventually makes it back to the past and that the Avengers eventually emerge victorious in Endgame. The TVA would not interfere because old Steve's life was part of the sacred timeline, and was thus part of the way things were meant to be. This, however, does not take into account his decision to leave Bucky. So what if there was a better explanation? Lucky for us, we believe there is. What if the directors are right, and Steve created a branching timeline? Wouldn't this have caused a Nexus event, and alerted the TVA? Not necessarily if this popular fan theory proves to be true. The crux of this half of the theory is that Steve did not in fact marry Peggy Carter in this new timeline. When Sam Wilson asks if Steve wanted to talk about his wife, he famously responds, "No, I don't think I will," which was widely seen as a simple comedic response from an old man. But what if there was more to it than that? What if Steve was able to return the stones and return to the 1940s, just to get his dance with Peggy Carter, but never had any intention of destroying her family life and living out the rest of his life with her? If he saw she had a husband and children, then Steve would be the kind of character to understand that he would be in the wrong. Though he wouldn't like it and would be tremendously heartbroken, Steve is the kind of person that would make the sacrifice to let her live out her life with her husband, stepping aside and letting her be happy after finally getting his dance. So if he got his dance with Peggy and then left her alone to live her own life, then who did he live out the remainder of his retirement with on this new timeline? The answer, my friends, according to this theory, is Natasha Romanoff. Fans have been pining to see Steve and Natasha cultivate a romantic relationship for years, only for this to never come to fruition on screen. but what if Steve was able to get Natasha back in exchange for the Soul Stone? Keep in mind that if Steve decided to stay with Peggy, he very likely could have been pruned by the TVA, breaking away from the sacred timeline. Steve carried with him enough Pym particles to traverse the timeline and return the Infinity Stones, but it stands to reason that he didn't have a limitless supply. If he was able to get Natasha back, then she would still likely have her suit and GPS on her as she did when she died. But if she helped him to complete his quest, then they may have run out of Pym particles somewhere along the way. Steve gets his dance with Peggy, and then he and Natasha are trapped together in the 40s and only one time jump left, meaning that only one of them is able to return home. This theory proposes that they elected to live out their retirement together, eventually cultivating the romantic relationship that fans have been so eagerly awaiting and living out their lives until Natasha one day died of old age, allowing Steve to finally return to the main timeline with the last jump in order to pass the shield on to Sam. So if these two deviants lived out their lives on this new timeline, then why didn't the TVA take notice or interfere? Neither Steve nor Natasha were meant to exist in this timeline, meaning that if they stayed hidden in relative seclusion, they may have not impacted the timeline significantly enough to cause a Nexus event and split the timeline far enough for the TVA to get involved. Their existence may have been negligible enough to not warrant the interference of the TVA. If Steve had elected to marry Peggy and destroy her home, then the ramifications would have likely caused the TVA to get involved and prune both of them, seeing as Peggy was always meant to exist and play a role in her time. But if two figures were never meant to exist in this reality and only impact the lives of another, then perhaps the TVA was either not aware of this Nexus event or simply doesn't deem it important enough to interfere with. This allows Steve's character to remain intact as a selfless, honorable hero who would not destroy Peggy Carter's home life. It allows him to live out his retirement, and it makes sense as to why he elected to stay in the past instead of returning home. If he had one jump left, and coming home would have meant leaving Natasha stranded in the unfamiliar time with no one to turn to, he may have decided that Bucky was safe among friends such as Sam than Natasha would have been, and that at that moment, Natasha needed him more than Bucky did. Therefore, the better option was to either stay with Natasha or insist that she be the one to make the jump home. She could have refused the offer, and the two could have decided that this was the best option for everyone. But again, these are just two very distinct theories that I would love to hear your thoughts on. How do you feel about the first one? And why do you feel the TVA did not get involved? And how do you feel about the second one, and Steve and Natasha living out their lives together? Do you think Steve may have actually lived out his retirement with Natasha and not Peggy? And if so, do you think that this is a more fitting end for Steve's character? Personally, I really do like the ending that we got in Avengers Endgame, and I like the idea of Steve ending up with Peggy. This is just a theory proposed as to why the TVA did not arrive if this was a Nexus event. And if so, what is your theory why the TVA did not arrive if Steve did actually end up with Peggy? As always, my friends, hit that subscribe button to assemble and join our team, and have a great day.